Welcome to Chapter 4, everyone. In this chapter, we will be diving into agriculture, which is the science of farming. Agriculture is a human endeavor that is tied up very closely with the environment. Agriculture impacts the environment, and the environment impacts agriculture in turn. So, in this chapter, we are going to tackle a few learning outcomes. We are going to explain the modernization of agriculture and its consequences. We are going to define genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, as well as genetically engineered crops, or GEs, how they are created, what progress, challenges, and consequences have arisen from them. We will also recognize the relationship between exposure to persistent organic pollutants, or POPs, and human health. And finally, we will explain alternative agricultural practices and soil management practices. So let's begin by first taking a brief look at where agriculture has come from so that we can then talk about how it has been modernized in the 20th century. So, agriculture, as I said, is the science of farming, and it's thought to have been adopted by human civilization about 12,000 years ago. And this marked a transition from a more nomadic hunter gatherer lifestyle to a lifestyle where humans were able to establish a more stable food supply and therefore establish permanent settlements, communities, towns, and cities. Interestingly, agriculture was developed in many separate parts of the world within the same period of a few thousand years, possibly due to favorable climate factors on Earth at the time. And research on archaeological evidence from this time period indicates that agriculture led to a five-fold increase in the human population that was able to be sustained. So the human population grew into its new limits that were allowed by agriculture's stable food supply. And it didn't just grow into those new limits, but it also pushed those limits. So by the mid 1800s, the world population had pushed those limits so far that there were millions of people dying of famine across the globe every decade. And this figure here plots the number of millions of people dying of famine around the world by decade. And the decades are listed on the horizontal axis. And things seem to be getting worse. And the trajectory of where things were headed in the future was potentially catastrophic. So between 1930 and 1970, the world population doubled from 2 billion to 4 billion in just 40 years' time. And it was on track to continue to grow exponentially and double again. And in this book entitled The Population Bomb, which was published in 1968 by Stanford professor Paul Ehrlich and Stanford senior researcher Ann Ehrlich, the text opened with, quote, "The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. At this late date, nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world death rate." And these authors were hardly alone. The concern about the dire food security situation across the world was widespread. But as the century progressed, the number of deaths from famine dropped off steeply, and it remains lower today than the historical numbers. All the while, the world population did continue to grow exponentially as predicted to the almost 8 billion people on Earth today. So, what happened? What happened to avert the hunger crisis that the world was facing back in the mid 20th century? The answer is the Green Revolution happened. And the Green Revolution was a transformative shift in global food production that was brought about by scientific advancements in agriculture, improved farming practices, and also new technologies and innovations that were developed. And it led to this stunning increase in agricultural productivity and efficiency, so much so that the growing world population was able to feed itself better than ever. The picture that you see here illustrates the difference in productivity in plots of land before and after the Green Revolution. So, pre-Green Revolution in 1940, the amount of land required to produce 10 bushels of corn is represented in that column on the far right. And by 1980, 10 bushels of corn was the yield of the much, much smaller plot that you see just to the left of it. Between 1950 and 1984, the world grain production increased by 200%, and that is thanks to a number of key innovations. One of these was the introduction of high-yield crop varieties. So scientists selectively bred important crop plants for higher production levels, as well as other valuable traits like disease resistance and tolerance to environmental stressors. Synthetic fertilizers were also introduced. So this included manufactured nitrate fertilizers, which came into popular use, as did fertilizers made from mined phosphate and sulfur. And given that these are often the limiting nutrients in the soil, crop yields increased significantly in response to applying these fertilizers. The Green Revolution also saw the introduction of pesticides, chemicals that kill organisms that threaten crop plants. So these included herbicides that kill invasive weeds, insecticides that kill insects, and fungicides that kill fungi that can also cause infections in plants. Improved irrigation techniques were also developed so that the water and land could be used more efficiently. And this included drip irrigation and sprinkler irrigation, which are more efficient than flood irrigation, which was previously used commonly. And finally, agriculture was further mechanized. So new machines were developed for planting, harvesting, tilling, processing. So many of the steps of the farming process became automated and therefore more efficient and cheaper. So together, these advancements led to a massive increase in agricultural output in a very short period of time. But one thing that you may have noticed from that previous figure that you saw, and here it is again, is that while there was this enormous leap in productivity between 1940 and 1980, the productivity gains that have been made since 1980 have been far more modest. So things began to level off around 1990 when those Green Revolution innovations sort of reached their maximum potential. So, how has agricultural science been working to improve agricultural productivity since then? What's responsible for these more modest gains that you see since 1990? That's going to be the subject of the next section as we continue our discussion of agriculture.